Hello everybody, my name is Jürgen Gmach and it's fantastic to be back already for the second time here in the beautiful city of Malaga and in the stunning La Termica. Today I want to help you to create your very first contribution to open source. Contributing to open source may seem intimidating. Like, is this something for me or only for some professionals? Do I have enough experience? Or do I know where to look for a suitable open source project? Or maybe there are so many out there, which one should I choose? You might also wonder why to contribute to open source at all. Well, what are the benefits of that? So you have any of these questions, I'm here to answer them and you're in the right place. My mission today is that after this talk, all your doubts will be gone and I will show you that anyone can contribute to open source, regardless of experience, regardless of professional status, of gender, of home language, and especially about age, because it's never too late to join the party. So before we go on, we need to define, or we have a look what is open source actually. So in Wikipedia says, open source is source code that is made freely available for possible modification and redistribution. Okay, that's clear. But when did it start? So I think it's even started in the 50s and 60s when IBM shared its source code for the open source for the operating system, but the term wasn't used back then. It was a different time. And actually, the term was shaped for an event organized by the O'Reilly Technical Publisher in 1998 only. And the event was attended by the leaders of open source, free software, including Linus Torvalds, who is known to be the creator of Linux, Larry Wall, Guido von Drossem, the creator of Python. And there was they wanted to create a new term for this whole movement. And there were a couple of them, like sourceware and other things, like imagine it would be named like that. And at one point, they made a poll and open source one. And you need to imagine, like, this was only 1998. This is just barely a little bit more than 25 years. And as you may know already, that open source is changing the world. So what are the benefits of open source? And whatever I will say here now is especially true for a beginner. So you still might wonder why you would want to contribute to open source. And I think there are two groups of that. Like, the one is about the project and the one is about yourself. So for the project, it can be used everywhere in the world by anyone. Like my neighbor uses Linux and he's older than 80 to write documents, to surf the web, to write a couple of emails, to do their taxes. My dentist uses Ubuntu to secure the patient data. My dad uses LibreOffice for his written correspondence. And I use open source for many things, also to organize photos for my family. One of my colleagues uses open source to create music, which he shared last week with us. And as you can see, open source is used across by many different individuals and also by companies alike, maybe because of a budget, maybe because of security reasons, or maybe just because it's the better solution. These are just a very few of many, many examples. And one thing which really fascinates me from open source is the scaling effect. There is maybe one tool, one contribution, and it could be used by 3 people, by 5 people, or by millions and millions of people across the world. Maybe for their personal benefit, or maybe to make a living. That could be a start for their business. So, and on the other hand, these were like about the project itself and about yourself. Have you ever used a tool which had maybe a bug, or It was almost perfect, but there was this little feature missing. If you open source, you can have a look at it and either apply the changes yourself or get somebody motivated to it. You have all the options available. And one thing which really stands out also for me is you can work together with the brightest people and the brightest mind all over the world. And they help you grow. You will get feedback from other professionals for your proposals. You will see how other professional people work across the globe. And take me as an example. At the beginning of my career, I was working at a small, local, rural company in Bavaria with 20 engineers, and we had no contact to the dev world outside. There were good engineers, but there were not a lot of exchange of knowledge. I learned what they knew, and they knew what they were taught before. And the knowledge was quite limited in hindsight, especially about Python. This is the language I use the most and I love because I was the only Python developer. So there was nobody being able to teach me anything. And when I started to contribute to open source, I collaborated with the brightest people on planet Earth. And they were like people from Bloomberg, from Facebook, from Google, and from Canonical. And the feedback I got was invaluable. So you will get exposure to this whole tech world, and you will get noticed at some point. And you can build a professional network. Just like here, when you go to a conference, this is also a great way to connect with other people, to learn how they are things doing, to get to know the people. Maybe this opens job opportunities. And when you contribute to open source, this will stand out. You will be 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, or if you think about not only developers, maybe 1 in 1,000,000 who contributes to open source. And this could help your career. This could even help you land a job. I'm an engineering manager at Canonical, and there I review a lot of applications, I do a lot of interviews, and we have one question there, like, did you contribute to open source? And I don't have the concrete numbers, but about from 100 people, 1 maybe says they do. Everybody else is saying like, oh, open source is a great idea, obviously, when they apply at our company, but I never contributed to it. So if you do something like that, it will stand out. And if you can put, I have contributed to open source on your resume, this will be a game changer. So as mentioned, my name is Jürgen Gmach. I'm an interim engineering manager or senior software engineer at Canonical. You can always reach out to me on X, meanwhile called, or on Fostodon, or on Mastodon. I also have a blog. I'm a maintainer of Tox, which gets downloaded about 20 million times a month. I'm a Python software fellow, and I live in the Bavarian forest still. We have trees, lakes, fields, and fiber to the home, and that's all that's necessary. I have contributed, meanwhile, to more than 300 repositories or open source projects, and meanwhile, before I collaborated with them, but now I work for Canonical full-time on open source, and I maintain the build and the publishing infrastructure of Ubuntu, which is arguably one of the most famous or popular Linux distribution. The thing you need to know here, I only started to contribute to open source a couple of years ago, after being a professional web and backend developer for more than a decade. While I used open source like Apache or other things or PHP before, I never saw a reason or a chance to contribute to open source. At one of my first jobs, I inherited an old intranet application which was written in Python 2 and used SOAP 2, which is a super old Python application server. And while migrating Python 2 to Python 3 was well understood, Migrating SOAP 2 to be compatible with Python 3 was not possible, as I was alone, the only Python developer. But luckily, SOAP was open source. And so from many different companies, people came together to have regular sprints where we worked together on porting that. And this went on for like 3 or 4 years, and there were like up to 20, 30 people working on it. So you can imagine if this was something your company would need to pay. That's an insane amount of money. But the whole open source community made this possible. And that's where my journey to open source started and hopefully never ends. Your journey might be very different. Before we go on, we also need to clarify what is an open source contribution. The most obvious thing is clear. It's like contributing code, adding a new feature or fixing a bug. But this is also one of the most elaborate ways to contribute. And there are many more, a lot of them. So what also counts, definitely as an open source contribution, is creating a bug report, a proper one, or creating a feature request. Try to, if you do that, always have a look at the repository, at the project, and try to follow the guidelines of the maintainer. They always slightly vary a little bit, and try to give a very complete description of the problem or of the feature. That would be basically, what did you expect? What did actually happen? And in the best case, also create a minimal reproducer. That is, what kind of code do you need to execute to trigger this bug? And then you're happy as the maintainer. Like it's pretty straightforward how to go on from there. You could also help triaging tickets. That is, if you go to an open source project, they usually have a huge list of open issues, and you could have a look at them. Are they still valid? Are they maybe outdated? Maybe you find 2 tickets which are about the same thing, they're duplicates, so you can help the maintainer. This is also a valuable open source contribution. And there is also improvements for design or usability. They're highly valuable, but not a lot of people do that. And last but not least, contributing to the project's documentation is also super valuable. When I use a library for the first time, I always try the examples which are listed. And more often than not, I find, no, they don't work exactly like that. Maybe it's just outdated and there's a newer version or the API has changed. And then I just update or create a merge proposal to update the examples. Maintainer is happy, and as a nice side effect, I also get to know whether they're still working on the project and reacting to my pull request. Because sometimes open source projects just fall asleep, and then it's probably not worth to put in a lot of effort into them. So how do you actually find an open source project for contribution? And this is highly individual. I never look for projects to contribute to. They just come to me. When I need a new library, as I mentioned, I try a couple of examples. Maybe I find that a little feature is missing or there's a bug in there, or maybe I need to make it compatible with the Python version I work. And that's my way. Everybody needs to find a way. I have a new colleague, and he picked a couple of very high-profile open source projects, like Django and a couple of other ones, and he was super motivated and worked with them and contributed a couple of features to them. And when I had the interview with him back then, I was super impressed. Like, this was, as I mentioned, this stands out. And another example is, if you have used Python, pip is the package installer for Python. And one of the maintainers there, at some point back in his early days, he was just interested how dependency resolving works. And he looked into it, and he looked into the source code, and he created a couple of contributions. And meanwhile, he's one of the maintainers of a tool which is used by every Python developer on the single world. How does this sound? You could also go to for example, to GitHub and search for good first issue. This is usually a label which is used by maintainers to indicate this is an easy entry point to help the project. Because there are definitely also very complex problems out there, so it's a good thing to look for that. And to make things even a little bit easier, there's a website out there which is called goodfirstissue.dev, and the people there curate those good first issues and really look for an easy one. And when we speak about how to find a way to contribute to open source, I also want to highlight the Open Documentation Academy, an initiative created by my dear colleague Graham, who gave a workshop earlier. I think maybe it's even still running. And this is about the collaboration between Canonical's documentation team and documentation newcomers, experts, and those in between. And it's worked like that. Open source projects, not only from Canonical, but any, can create nicely defined and specified issues. And the documentation team helps you or anybody to work on them and to successfully complete them. They won't leave you alone, like, oh, here's the ticket and work. No, they will sit down with you. They will chat you via the ticket, but they also have open documentation office hours where you can join. And I've taken part a couple of times, and people from across the world are joining. And this helps the projects a lot, but also you. This might be a very convenient way for your very first open source contribution. And I say this with confidence, the lowest barrier possible. For some open source projects, it's a little bit harder, but this is they take your hand and guide you. And this works great from my own experience. I have a project which was created 20 years ago by 30 plus developers, and there's a lot of documentation, and the team size shrunk over time. Meanwhile, we are growing again. And documentation has been outdated. And I created a couple of issues, and there's so much passion from people just picking up, and you work with them, and that's great. So, as I mentioned, the workshop from Graham is at the current time, at the same time, so you couldn't probably take part. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to sit down with you after this time, and we won't leave until you have created your first open source contribution. Maybe for 2 to 3 people. If everybody stays, then I need to go back on Sunday. So actually, how to start contributing to a project? I'm a maintainer of open source project myself, so I think I can tell you a little bit about the expectations from a maintainer's perspective. What you shouldn't do is just go to the project, check out the source code or documentation, just create a pull request. Because maybe whatever you think it's missing or what you think is wrong is not what the maintainer thinks. And at the end, the maintainer needs to maintain it for a number of years. I had for one project, I had a contribution about a translation of my project into a language which I cannot speak, and I don't have somebody trusted around me who speaks that language. Like, what should I do with that? They can do it. What is if I add a new feature and he's gone? Who translate that part into this language? Or when you think about being an open source maintainer, a lot of people come to you and they want new features, but you need to maintain them for maybe 5 years or 10 years, and the scope grows. So you need to, the best practice is go to the maintainers and have a chat with them. Create a ticket before any meaningful contribution and have a chat, like how this should be implemented and whether this is wanted at all. And once you have created a pull request, please be patient. Many open source maintainers do their work in their spare time, in the evening, where they need to decide, oh, should I go out with my kids to the sea or to the in my case, to the lake, or should I sit down and work for an open source for free? So please be patient, because sometimes life goes first. And eventually, they will have a look. And then whatever how it goes forward, you will get great feedback and it will help you grow for free. To reiterate on the key takeaways and to recap, think about the benefits of contributing to open source and whether they apply for you. Then find a project you're interested in and then get in touch with the maintainer. And then enter this magical world of open source. And there's one last thing I want to say. Contributing to open source should not exclusively be at the expense of your spare time. If you work in a company which uses open source, talk to your boss and ask him directly, like, we are using that. Can I spend a couple of hours a week on improving that tool, which benefits also us? And while this is now different at Canonical, back in my old company where there was no notion of open source before, I was surprised. I didn't expect where my boss said, yes, obviously, do it. It's good for us and for all the others. And once again, if you're interested to leave this conference as an open source maintainer, not a maintainer, a contributor, stay with me after the talk and we will sit down and create your very first contribution to open source. Thank you.
As maintainers, there is a feeling of loneliness around you when you have starting a project and you are going on through it and nobody's helping you to build it, or people is getting in on board and a few months later they are going out. How does it feel? Because I feel like there is some loneliness behind that.
Right, but I haven't created too many open source projects from scratch. I maintain a lot meanwhile, but they were created by others. But what I see is that creating an open source project is always like you're driven by passion and you do something and you're really passionate and you drive it until it's there. And I think it doesn't, this loneliness, as you mentioned, doesn't apply there. But after maybe a couple of years, like the fascination is a little bit less. Maybe you don't even use it anymore, but a lot of people now use it. And what do you think about that? And you don't want to let them down. And then people come with a lot of bug reports and like they don't apply to you. And then this is maybe the time when you need to make tough decisions what to do. Obviously, it's always good to pull in a couple of more maintainers. And I think there is a huge difference between those. When you think of open source, like you have Linux, where probably more than 90% or even more of the contribution comes from professional software developers during the work time, and other tools which are created by someone in rural Bavaria or somebody else, somewhere else. So I think there needs to be two things. Hopefully you have some fallback to some other maintainers who can step in. Life gets busy at some times. When I built my house, I wasn't able to spend 4 hours an evening on looking at open source. Then the other maintainer stepped in. When he got sick, I worked a little bit more and this evened out. At some point, like when I think about the Tox project, neither of us had time. And there was a serious bug in there. And then the community stepped up. And this was pretty awesome. And whatever you think about that, you don't have a contract with your users. Don't feel obliged to push harder than your limits, to burn out on things, which happens in open source in other areas. So if there is no time, just tell them. And they need to live with that. I know people get angry maybe, but they're free to apply the changes, to fork the project if they think it's going too slow. So think about yourself and If it makes you happy, continue, and if not, then go to the next thing. Like the project Tox, the really big one, was created by Holger Krekel back then, and he's like a brilliant mind and a serial inventor. He creates things and then he leaves them, but it's there for others to pick up and then continue. And maybe I will drop support for Tox in a while when I don't have any time anymore, and either somebody else steps up or there will new things emerge. So as far as understood, you think about the problem. I mentioned that if you want to contribute to an open source project in your native language, which is Spanish, and maybe the maintainer doesn't speak Spanish. And I think the first thing is to reach out to him. And usually open source maintainers have a big network of people they trust and they work with. And I think for a language like Spanish, it's much more highly likely that you will find someone. And if they agree, then go ahead. If you can like find one of your friends, maybe to want to step in, that would be a great idea. Yeah, and this like depends a little bit on the people. Like many people think like, especially in the tech industry, like everybody speaks English, but that's not true. Like you will, when you have documentation or the tool translated to a native language, you will open to a completely different scope of users. Right. Right. It's just to repeat for the video. Um, when you see a project where there is no man page in Spanish, you have the urge to help the project. Right. And to enable your peers. And that's super noble. So I think it's a blessing for the Spanish community.
So it's easy to contribute to open source when you work for Canonical or Red Hat or something like that. Do you have any tips to convince your boss when you were in a non-open source company?
That's what I did. Like I mentioned, like back in the days, I worked for Windows. They have like a Windows application written in Smalltalk, and I was the only Python developer. And I asked my boss for a meeting, and I sat down with him and I explained to him like we are using this. I need to improve it anyway, and can I make my contributions open source so anybody else can contribute? And I was surprised. They said yes. So maybe there are harder bosses to argue with, but it worked out, and I think there's no cost involved to ask them and to deliver your thing. And maybe it doesn't work. Like the company at some point wanted to drop all open source and buy things and wanted to focus on their core, no core business and no more developments on their own, for the better or worse. And at some point I said like, okay, that's good for you, maybe not for me. And then I had a look what's out there. Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you very much. And if you're interested, stay here and we do it together. Thanks.